All good to go? Okay, welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is Blake Redding, and doing a slow and waffly introduction because I know at 12 o'clock sharp, that is when we're starting to stream on in, and participant numbers are increasing as I speak. So we've got over 100 people registered for today's session, which we're quite excited about. Pleasure to be beaming in to people from across Australia, and I think we've even got some people internationally as well, which is quite exciting. And I'm joined by Charles Lentini, our principal consultant. There's still a few more people coming on in. As people are joining us, I'd like to acknowledge a country within which we are joining you today. So we join you from Yagara and Turrbal people, and we would pay our respects to elders past, emerging and present, and our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us today. It's quite a specialised, interesting and important topic that we speak of. And now I think the numbers are slowing down in terms of joining. Just the traditional housekeeping, we're all probably well accustomed to the process that we'll step through for today. We will be stepping through some powerful content between now and about 12:50, 12:55 to keep some room for questions. If you did have questions throughout the session, please do use the Q&A icon to pass your questions on. I'm going to keep an eye on those throughout the session. A lot of the content's going to be driven by Charles. So as best I can, I'll thread through questions as we go and keep some to the end. If we don't have enough time to cover all of the questions, that's something that we'll look to respond to in the conclusion of the session. So I think we're sitting at about 12:02 now. We still have a couple of people joining us, and might be timely for Charles, if you wanted to step in to introduce the session and the background to the research.
Okay, thank you very much, Blake. My name's Charles Lentini. As Blake indicated, I work in the investigations team of Mappian, and we've prepared this webinar on the topic of trauma-informed approach to workplace investigations. This subject has become quite topical of late. The research and material, most of it has come from US-based research, so it's quite topical in the US and obviously becoming quite topical in Australia. Obviously in Australia, for example, Queensland, we've had the Industrial Relations Act 2016 amendments, but also in the federal arena, the Sex Discrimination and Fair Work Respect at Work Amendments Act 2021. And that has shown that there's an increasing emphasis on workplace sexual harassment complaint matters. Now, obviously, arising out of those sorts of types of matters, people can tend to be traumatized, and thus the importance of having an approach that deals with those particular situations. So without further ado, we'll just go to the topic. So thank you very much, Blake. So initially, what we'll be talking about is what is trauma and how does it affect people? Blake, being in the organisational development area, will be mainly dealing with that particular area because that's very important, because you need to know the signs of trauma and also trying to differentiate between just plain anxiety and so forth. Then we'll be turning over to the trauma-informed approach, which is essentially the fundamental part of this particular webinar. It will involve pre-questions, questions, and conclusion type items. Following on from that, we'll be dealing with confidentiality and actually looking at confidentiality not from an investigator's point of view, but from the actual interviewee's point of view, a person that's traumatized. Moving on, we'll be looking at the role of the investigator, and that's quite fundamental, because just because a trauma-informed approach is utilised doesn't mean that there's any sway with respect to the principles of natural justice or procedural fairness. And lastly, we'll be looking at the importance of a supportive environment in actually supporting a trauma-informed approach workplace investigation, if that needs to be the case. So yes, we'll now proceed to the next slide. Thank you, Blake.
Okay, thanks, Charles. So I would declare as an organizational psychologist, my specialty is in relation to psychology in the workplace, not of a clinical matter. But one of the items that I thought would be helpful to ground us in before we step into the process side of trauma-informed investigations is just to provide, I guess, some clarity or some working definitions of some of the language or words that will be relevant, I guess, for the context of today's session. So I guess when we think about trauma, I would first start to say, well, stress, we would define stress as a physiological response that somebody experiences, and there can be a particular stimulus that triggers that, and that trigger leads to what most people would refer to as that threat response, which means we're activating a hormonal response that prepares our body for fight or flight, or the freeze response, or sometimes the social flocking, where we do come together to people like us to feel a higher sense of safety. So that's what we speak to when we speak about stress, something that does trigger, that is triggered by fear. So fear is the nature of stimulus that will trigger stress in us. And when we speak about trauma, I guess one of the key specifics about trauma is that trauma relates to, there's a moment in our life where we did experience fear, and that fear did trigger our stress response, but somehow that response created a neurological change to the degree that we will have the fear and stress that was related to that initial trauma at times in the future that are what we call maladaptive, or that which doesn't serve us. So if we wake up in the morning feeling quite stressed and scared because of something that's happened in the past, that is what we call maladaptive, because it isn't helpful. In comparison to the fear response in the moment is often quite helpful for us to get out of a situation that could cause us harm, or helping us to aggress out of the situation. So the other aspect to consider when we do think about the topic of trauma-informed, is also the disparity between trauma and anxiety, in the sense that anxiety is something that a lot of people will experience during an investigation process. And when people are experiencing trauma, it is not uncommon for anxiety to be associated with that as well. However, when people experience anxiety, it's not as common for trauma to be associated with that. So one of the working definitions of stepping into this space is that although we might notice people presenting in similar ways, whether they're experiencing trauma or anxiety, trauma, is triggered by a past event, so something that's happened to us in the past, and it's creating a fear response in the moment. Whereas anxiety, is a fear response to something that could happen in the future. So we won't be going into too much detail further into the session about the difference between the two constructs, but just grounding us in those definitions can be helpful. One of the key, I guess, signs or impacts of trauma that is quite relevant to today's conversation is that one of the self-protective mechanisms of trauma is to actually fragment and distort memories as they are getting made in the moment, and then how that can then affect us in the future, where we might start to share information about a particular event that caused us trauma, and how our memories can actually be distorted because of the physiological response that our minds have to situations that will affect some people. So that's probably the extent of neuroscience and psychology from a definition perspective for the session, but really quite relevant, I guess, as we step through the process, knowing that investigations can be quite anxiety provoking, and it will interact for some people with that aspect of trauma. So I think to transition across to yourself, Charles, and from an expertise perspective, I think one of the key signs of trauma in terms of it impacting memory, I think that's a good segue into how does this affect us in an investigation process?
Thank you very much, Blake. So moving on to the next slide. these observations about trauma and memory would normally lead an investigator to make adverse assumptions about credibility. So an investigator that did not understand what Blake was speaking about in terms of how trauma affects memory may conclude that this person is not telling the truth or is not a reliable witness. But in cases of where the person is traumatized, that doesn't necessarily mean what they're saying is untruthful or they're lying. And that's a very important thing for an investigator to understand, not to make an adverse assumption about credibility when someone is showing signs of actual trauma and issues with memory. And that is not just with investigation processes. It can happen in with respect to tribunal or court matters and so forth, where, for example, a female victim is talking about a sexual assault matter of that nature. Same sort of things could arise there, and adverse assumptions can be made in relation to credibility when that's not correct. So it's very important that investigators understand this psychological process with respect to trauma and not let it adversely affect the investigation, because ultimately an investigation is trying to find truth and what the true state of the affairs were in relation to what the allegations are. So thank you very much.
Great. And I think that leads us into essentially the trigger or the need for having clarity about what we actually mean by a trauma-informed, response. So how would we define this, Charles?
Thank you, Blake. So a trauma-informed approach, what essentially is that? And we'll obviously go into more detail later in the webinar. Well, for the investigator, it means that the person which is the investigator, has the ability to identify trauma. So they have some sort of training or understanding of what the signs of trauma are and how it can affect memory. And when you're actually in the investigation, sitting there and with an interviewee in front of you, actually acknowledging that this person, they're experiencing trauma, they're a traumatized person. And that trauma is unrelated to the present matter, which is obviously the investigation. So it's really important to recognize the trauma and then adapt your interview to avoid re-traumatizing or triggering the interviewee again. So it may be the case that, and in most cases, I would say in workplace relations, you wouldn't have a traumatized interviewee. And a lot of these particular mechanisms probably won't be absolutely necessary, but they're always good to use. But in the cases that you do have a traumatized interviewee, then you adapt the interview accordingly. We'll go to the next slide. And in terms of a trauma-informed investigator, what attributes do they have? Well, they have a high level of professional empathy. And what is empathy? Empathy is the ability to recognize, understand, and share the thoughts and feelings of another person. Developing empathy is crucial for establishing a relationship and behaving compassionately. So obviously you're going to have that investigator-interviewee relationship, but it's important to show empathy with that particular person. So for example, and we'll go further into this throughout the webinar, but where someone is obviously suffering and upset and so forth, it would be words such as, "I can see this is hard for you to talk about." So that's a way of showing empathy. Patients, obviously, if you do have a traumatized interviewee, there will be the interview will take longer. There might be breaks. There's going to be emotions and so forth. So you're going to have to be more patient. The other thing that's quite important, and I think that it can be a trap for investigators. So it's following the rules of procedural fairness, or otherwise known as natural justice. So that's comprised of two rules, one being the fair hearing rule, that the decision maker must give a person an opportunity to be heard before making a decision. That's pretty straightforward. But the other is the rule against bias. And obviously, decision maker must not be biased in any way that prevents that person from making a decision in an objective and impartial manner. So that can be actual bias or a reasonable or an apprehension of bias. So an apprehended bias occurs if a fair-minded observer might reasonably apprehend that the decision maker might not bring an impartial mind to the resolution of the question. Okay, so in that regard, in this practical situation, you've got an interviewee that's traumatized. It's basically falling apart in front of you, very emotional and so forth. It's very easy to make comments that could show in some way or form that you are biased towards that particular interviewee. So that's why it's very important that you show empathy, but you don't go so far as to make comments that would say that you are biased in favour of the interviewee and against the actual respondent. So empathy is a way of actually recognising that the person is having a difficult time, but not going so far as saying, and also that must be the case that what you were saying is absolutely true prior to actually hearing all the evidence, witnesses and respondent and so forth. So very, very important that procedural fairness for the investigator is maintained. Otherwise, the actual investigation report, the outcome will not be acceptable. Also, expert investigative interviewing skills. So that's going to be, in this particular case, having trauma-informed questions and so forth, and the process that you do that will go into that. Obviously, lastly, adaptable. You'll be adapting your question to suit the traumatized interviewee and having good and consistent communication with that person. So for a trauma-informed investigator, these are the primary things that you need to actually have.
And I think, Charles, in terms of where you mention it's important for an investigator to notice, if there are signs of trauma. And I think one of the key insights through having a conversation about a trauma-informed response is to help us notice there could be other reasons why somebody might be presenting a particular way, and in particular, the fragmentation of memories or recollection, to be a signal of the presence of trauma. And so I think that's an important part when we take the frame of an investigator. We're just having that understanding of knowledge where sometimes we can see, I guess, shaky memory or shaky recall as a sign of hiding something. It could be a sign of something else as well, which is quite relevant, particularly when paired with more stronger emotions in session. And I think coming back to the point that you're raising here is it is about obtaining as much information as possible with as little stress as possible. And I think where the knowledge that trauma may or is a part of an investigation would possibly arise as the administration side of an investigation being organised begins at the time at which a grievance is raised, and that would often be with an HR business partner or a manager in the business. The other time that it's likely to show up would be where you are an investigator, you have commenced an investigation, and you're you've started or commenced, and the signs are telling you that trauma could, be a situation here, or in fact, you might be receiving information from the person you're interviewing that is articulating that trauma is forming a part, of this experience for them. I think that's where, what are the first steps for the investigator in that moment?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Blake. And as that current slide said, it's the goal of the investigator to collect information. So when you're doing an investigation, it's essentially a fact-finding mission to obtain all the relevant facts and then make a decision. But certainly when you get into the interview stage, you would not automatically go in and ask questions, particularly in the case of a traumatized interviewee. So, but certainly you would build rapport with that particular person you're interviewing. So, rapport is having a close and harmonious relationship in which people of groups of concern understand each other's feelings or ideas and communicate well. It's a skill of developing harmonious relationships in that particular investigator interviewee sort of realm. I suppose a practical example would be, thank you for coming in to see me today. How are you? It's good to meet you, those sorts of things. So building that sort of relationship, that rapport with that particular person. Also explaining the investigator's role in a clear and transparent manner, introducing yourself. I'm investigating this particular matter. I'm an impartial person, and so forth. So these sorts of things are really good to start off the process, and they're also very good for any particular interview, even if the person is not traumatized. Obviously, allowing a support person, and that would have to have been done in advance, is vital, I think, for people who are anxious, let alone who are traumatized. So a support person, I think, is very vital. Next thing would be the need to feel safe. So obviously, if a person has been traumatized, they obviously have been in an unsafe type of situation. So the person is going to be quite sensitive to these sorts of matters. So you want to have a comfortable, quiet and private space for the interview, and waters and tissues available, obviously. If they get upset, the tissues would be of use. The other thing, and sort of relevant to that second point I made, is the ability to retain control. So if someone has been traumatized, let's just say, for example, by a sexual assault or sexual harassment matter, they've lost control. And so they're going to be quite concerned about retaining control. And that can be even about little things. So they're going to be quite worried as an interviewee about giving up control. So a few little things that can be done is allowing the interviewee, now this is within reasonable limits, to decide the date and time of the interview. The other thing that's important, which came up in the US research, is to say, well, look, allow them to sit where they like. So you might have a situation where there's a boardroom, they walk in, there's 7 or 8 chairs around the desk. They usually say, where do you want me to sit? Say, well, sit wherever you like. Choose a chair where we'd like to sit, and that's really good for someone who's traumatized, to actually retain that control. Again, to an investigator or an untraumatized person, that might seem like a very minor thing, but for someone who's been through a traumatic event, that can be a very big thing, and it can be very reassuring and help the interview proceed in a much more better way. So and we'll proceed to the next slide. Thank you. Obviously, and there's a fair amount that goes into trauma-informed interviews before the actual interview commences. So obviously, you'll be, and this will be, from the start, but recognizing the signs of trauma and so forth. So Blake's given a very good outline of that, and that was in the slide. So things such as lack of focus, fragmented or inconsistent memories, memory gaps, and so forth can be signs of that. Obviously, people who are traumatized, even very anxious people, are going to they have a tendency to use their hands, and they will benefit from having a piece of paper and a pen to write with, something to scribble, or a fidget spinner or something to use with their hands. So that can be of assistance to a traumatized person. The act of giving water in the research has come up as something of great benefit. So offering a drink of water to someone who's traumatized is quite beneficial, in the sense that you're showing that you're caring. There's a caring aspect of there, which helps with building rapport. And also, of course, the act of drinking requires a person to breathe, and that's inherently calming. So these are, you might think they're very minor sort of things, but for someone who's traumatized, that can be a very, very big benefit. And it might even help them to recall things much more better, because they'll be not as anxious.
Excellent. And Charles would say there's many investigators will have their own personal style that associates with the investigative process that they're following. And I think through that, there are going to be some investigators whose styles are likely to align quite automatically, with trauma-informed recommendations. And then in addition to that, there's going to be some people whose investigation styles, which are effective in most cases, might actually fly in the face of some of the advice or recommendations for trauma-informed investigations. And so the question is, what are some of the specific, I guess, items or questioning styles that are helpful for all of us, regardless of our investigation styles, to take on board?
Yes, thank you, Blake. Obviously, some people would be more, their behaviours or personality be more akin to a good communicative investigation style. Others may not, but they'll have to adapt to ensure that, particularly in traumatized interviewees, that they're actually getting the best information they can of that person. But essentially, again, prior to asking questions, you would be gently easing into the more formal part of the interview in terms of explaining your role as an investigator, and broadly asking the questions or issues that you wish to raise. Now, sometimes you will have a written type of complaint that's been put together, and you can basically have an idea of what the issues are. Normally, when you get instructions, either internally, externally, as an investigator, you'll get some sort of briefing about what the matter might be and what the claimed issues are, particularly in terms of sexual harassment and so forth. So you can broadly outline the matters or questions you wish to raise. This is probably a very important thing, I find, in my experience, because particularly if you're having to tape the interview, it's best to do this particular introductory part prior to the tape starting and getting the formal part of the evidence, so that if the person does get upset, and they usually do get upset and quite emotional, they can sort of get that out of their system, if I can say it that way, before they proceed with the formal part. So it can be very helpful in that regard, I feel. But sometimes you might have a person that would be a bit reluctant to actually speak and go forward with this particular process. So sometimes a motivational statement might be good. There's an example there, what they're doing may help others or may prevent harm to others, or something of that nature, that, what they're doing can or could be of benefit. So these sorts of things. So essentially, there seems, and you probably all be able to see, this is a fair bit of work that needs to go into conducting a trauma-informed interview prior to the actual interview starting. So these types of interviews can take longer than what a normal interview would be. Again, showing empathy. So an investigator needs to be neutral, but they can show empathy, because obviously someone who's traumatized will be very emotional. They might be crying. They might have to have breaks and so forth. So recognizing the difficulty with the process, but without acknowledging that the incident took place is what can be done. So that's part of showing empathy. We've covered that already, but again, there's an example. I can see this is hard for you to talk about. So that's a good way of showing empathy without saying that, that yes, the incident took place. Okay. So next is the trauma-informed questions. So did you want to say anything, Blake?
I just would add, and I think empathy is a feature through the presentation, and I think where you mentioned that neutrality and empathy can go hand in hand, and so I think that's important from a neutrality perspective of helping empathetically, not to judge as well. So I think sometimes when we talk about empathy, when it's genuine, we're sharing encourages or comments that are quite tentative, because we don't really know what's going on for the other person. So we're only comments to the effect that we're noticing things, and that acknowledgement is a really powerful part of empathy, because there isn't anything that we could say in that moment that would make things better. Acknowledgement is the best thing to do to help acknowledge the emotions, that the stress response that are being expressed. And so I think that aligning with the neutrality of investigation speaks to the philosophy of the trauma-informed approach. And I think the specific examples and questions that are coming up here, again, can help us have them in our toolkits, that they start as tools, and then through genuine care and concern into how this comes across, they become our own, and then they become genuine. Yep.
Okay, thank you. So we're now getting on to this slide, which is the actual trauma-informed question. So these types of questions would be specifically for those that are traumatized and the trauma is having a significant effect on their memory. So it's appropriate to focus on what the person is able to recall. So if you were asking questions in the normal sense, start from the beginning, point one, on this date, that time, that's not going to be too productive. But if you could say things like, start where you feel comfortable, tell me what you can remember, this would be more beneficial because it enables the person more control over how the narrative unfolds and actually minimizes contaminating fragile memories. So what can be shared. Now, I must say from the outset that, and I have touched on this before, that in most cases, people are able to recollect events in a chronological order. And if you can, then so be it, that's good. But if you find that's not the case because of a traumatized interviewee, then what can be shared question is obviously the way to go. Also, there's the what else question. So given the recollections might not be in order and in chronology, asking the standard question, what happened next, that can be counterproductive, again, for the same reasons that I've stated for the what can be shared. So instead, you'd be asking questions such as what else happened or what else do you remember? Again, that gives them more control over the narrative and prevents the contamination of fragile memory. So that's the nature of the questioning that you'll be doing with a traumatized interviewee. And now for the next slide. With a traumatized interviewee, now we've already touched on that there's going to be difficulty recollecting memories, but that's going to be more apparent when you're trying to ascertain date, time, and these sorts of things. So the use of electronic data or documentary evidence is going to be vital. So you're going to probably have a situation where a traumatized interviewee can tell you more or less what happened, but it may be the case when it gets to the time or date or something of that nature that might not be so good. So the use of data or evidence, documentary or electronic, would be of assistance. So that can help determine when incidents occurred and making the investigator less reliant on the interviewee's memory. So text messages, mobile phone logs, attendance sheets, and so forth. So these types of investigations and a lot of the investigations that we do actually do involve a lot of documentary evidence. So there could be anything up to thousands of pages of documents and so forth that you need to rely on anyway. But certainly they're very, very important in the case of a traumatized interviewee. The other point to note is sensory detail questions. So obviously, during a traumatic event, the primitive part of the brain records sensory information more effectively than cognitive parts. So why not use those other parts of the brain? So asking questions about the sense memories, such as the sounds, smells, sights, and touch, can enable interviewee to actually significantly recall more information. So, you know, a question could be, okay, so what do you recall when he touched you? So you're focusing on those sense memories and then try to get further information from that path, okay? So sensory detailed questions can be a good way to collect further information based on the sense memory.
And I think an item, you know, to be aware of, where as an investigator, you know, sometimes the presence of trauma may arise when we're in session. I think the other part of it is where if there is knowledge coming into it, and you mention that the importance for the interviewee to have control, you know, and around the support person is quite an important element, you know, in a sense that what can also be a human reaction that can also translate to the way that sometimes trauma is treated, is a sense that sometimes people will find if they've been through a stressful event, I'm using stress, not trauma, there can be a tendency to repeat the experience to friends and family and colleagues as a debrief. And that is therapeutic, because of what it is doing is reliving the experience in an environment that's safe. And that can be a line of therapy that is available. That's with an asterisk of with the appropriate support present. So I think that's where, as the information being elicited through questioning or sensory detail arises, and someone might be stepping back through what they have experienced as trauma, it's having the appropriate support available through that support person, and or ancillary support afterwards is really quite important for the welfare of people being involved. And I think the fragmentation of memory affects our ability to elicit facts, as you say, in chronological order. I think just from your perspective too around good questions, because I think when memories are more fragile, there's also a delicate balance between leading questions or priming questions. So just interested in what your advice is there, Charles.
Thank you, Blake. So obviously, once the interviewee has provided their account, there's going to be a few gaps, and likely to be a few gaps in the evidence. So you're going to have to ask follow-up questions for clarification in order to fill those gaps. So what does the investigator do? Well, they need to ask these sorts of questions, but they're doing it in an trauma-informed process by asking questions in a non-leading way. So obviously, rules of evidence, there's leading and non-leading questions and so forth. We'll be very, very mindful to ask non-leading questions in a sensitive manner, so because we don't want to contaminate the interviewee's recollection. So non-leading question is a type of question that does not imply or contain its own answer. So this type of question allows the interviewee to answer with a range of answers. So for example, assuming the interviewee has said that a male person said something that made them feel uncomfortable, based on that information provided by the interviewee, a non-leading question would be, what did he say to you that made you uncomfortable? So you're not introducing any other information other than what the person has told you. So it's important to ask those questions in a non-leading way.
And I think where you mentioned the process of the interviewing is likely to take longer, possibly in the form of frequent breaks, pauses, and as an interview comes to a conclusion, what combination of experience and research, is the advice for closing off the interview? Yeah, so the investigator will obviously be using this trauma-informed approach to reduce as far as possible the trauma or the adverse effects of actually having to speak again about the traumatic events that have occurred. We try to do this in the nicest possible way, but obviously we acknowledge that even speaking about traumatic experiences can trigger severe emotional reactions, so nightmares or intrusive thoughts and that sort of thing. So in closing the interview, I think it would be a good idea to assist with this by advising the interviewee that they may have emotional reactions to having participated in the interview and be prepared for those feelings. So obviously having a support person is vital, for these sorts of things. Show empathy while still using language appropriate to the neutral process, and we've already talked about that. Thank them for their cooperation. So obviously it would have been a big task to actually appear, speak before an investigation and so forth. So it would be appropriate to thank them. Acknowledging that this is a difficult topic to speak about, and if there's an employee assistance program or other support counselling service, then you should make that known to the interviewee. So these are the sort of things to actually finish off the interview. Yeah, and I think we're speaking to trauma informed in a sense that we're aware that trauma is being experienced, and I think that there's going to be those moments where there might be trauma being experienced, and it's from a clinical perspective, or there may not be, and in those, this is why helpful tactics that are being shared through this process also relate to having accessible, as a good habit, I suppose, in terms of where the organization's support mechanisms are and how to contact them, where it might not have been shared, or expressed by an interviewee that they are experiencing trauma. You might not be certain, though, through what you are noticing in how they are in the interview, that from a due diligence and care perspective, the connection of them with appropriate support afterwards by offering the support services, which is traditionally in the form of the EAP or other such counselling service in an organisation, is really quite helpful habit to adopt. And I think coming back to the empathy side, where I spend a lot of my time, in leadership development, coaching sort of sessions, less in investigation interviews. And so I just want to circle back to that empathy one again, Charles, for I guess specific tactics that relate to that come out as empathy, through the investigation process. Yeah.
Thank you, Blake. Yes, empathy is vitally important. And in that regard, and particularly as to not trigger a traumatized interviewee, is to avoid certain legal terminology. Now, obviously, the conduct of investigation is laced with legal terms. So there's natural justice, procedural fairness, rule against bias, and each party of the investigation has a particular formal name, such as a complainant, a respondent, victim, or whatever it might be. So you need to be very, very careful to avoid legal terminology that has a negative impact on that interviewee or discourages them from reporting, even in the first instance, or pursuing a complaint, by making them feel that they're overreacting or making a fuss, or treating the person as a non-person. So, the complainant walked in or the victim walked in. I mean, that's just going to set a person off. So very, very important. Do not refer to people, particularly, for example, in a sexual harassment complaint matter, as the complainant or the victim, because it really will set them off, and it has a disempowering effect. It treats people not as really people, but as entities or parties in a formal sort of process or something, which it is a formal process. And if you were talking to the HR manager or a lawyer or someone of that description, then it would be appropriate to use these terms, but don't use them when you're talking to an interviewee who's, for example, a complainant and so forth. You would never, ever refer to them as a complainant or the victim. You would refer to them preferably by their name. So yeah, just be very careful, because that could have a very adverse effect on the interview process.
And we do have a question that I'll bring up in a moment, but it might be helpful to bring it up after you speak to the topic of confidentiality.
Yeah.
Scenarios.
Yeah. Okay. So confidentiality is important for investigations, and because these are complaint matters or allegations, we don't know whether they're true or not. We're trying to protect reputations and so forth. So, and we don't want to contaminate the evidence is a very major part of it as well. So one person talking to another, witnesses talking to each other, that sort of thing. So the obligation of confidentiality should be very clear to all people that are interviewed. However, from the perspective of a traumatized interviewee or someone that's very anxious, in their mind, they're not concerned about that sort of confidentiality, their confidentiality. They're likely to be confidential. They're worried about how their information is going to be used. How are you, the investigator, going to treat their the information? So that's where they're coming from. And they're particularly going to be concerned about the person that is the subject of the alleged behaviour, the respondent. What information are they going to get? Is there going to be any retribution? What's going to happen? So that's a different way of looking at it from the traumatized interviewee's perspective. So how is the investigator going to deal with this confidential information? And essentially, it's appropriate to advise the interviewee. And with this particular slide, there's a more so from my practice what I do when I get these sorts of questions. So it's important to advise the interviewee, particularly in the case of the person making the actual complaint, that the information will only be released to those that need to know. It's on a need to know basis for the purpose of the investigation. So obviously witnesses, because if there's any witnesses that were present for this particular alleged event, then they will need to be interviewed. And I've never had an objection to that because that helps the case in terms of establishing the evidence. Obviously with witnesses, if the respondent were to provide some witnesses, you'll be interviewing them as well, so you have to be fair. The other thing, when responding to any allegations, so when the respondent, when responding to any allegations formulated by the investigator, so what we're saying there is that the interviewee has made their complaint, you're noting their complaint matters, but when they're put to the respondent, they're put to allegations. So the allegations don't come from the actual complainant, they come from the investigator based on the information provided. And that's can be quite reassuring, because it's not as if that they're the complainant and they're making a fuss and it's going directly to the respondent. There's a middle person there and their allegations. So obviously the evidence will be assessed and they'll be particularized in terms of those matters that will be put as allegations to the respondent. So, and the last one is obviously that there will be a disclosure to the organisation. So obviously the HR section of the organisation that has asked for the report or investigation to be done, there will be a report done with all their evidence, all the relevant evidence put in there for the organisation to consider. It's also beneficial to mention non-victimisation processes. So that can be quite reassuring in the sense that there's been a direction to all participants, particularly respondent, that they're not to victimise anyone for having participated in an investigation, and if so, there's breaches or disciplinary action for those people that do these sorts of things. There's been obligations of confidentiality on all participants in the investigation, and maybe there could be, and this is a question for HR, there may be arrangements in place administrative arrangements in place to separate certain parties, particularly the complainant and the respondent. So yeah, so that's some other tips there.
In the topic of confidentiality, I thought that was a helpful topic, because one of the questions was, is it appropriate for an investigator to request and follow up if an employee made use of an EAP provider, or if it's not recommended? I think a perspective would be, it might be different for external and internal investigators, where if you're an external investigator and it would be advised to seek one's consent, that you might encourage them, to share the EAP provider details. It may not be appropriate to follow up to see if they access them, but to seek their consent, that you might share with the HR business partner or the contact person that you had shared the EAP details with them, and to perhaps check in with them at a later time that they are okay, which would probably be part of the process anyway.
So is that's in terms of welfare, the employees' welfare? Yeah. I mean, I've had, so that's if they are accessing. I mean, that's a private matter between the employee and the counsellor or psychologist that is providing assistance to that particular person, normally funded by the employer. But I've had, just because I've had that question, I've had cases, and quite recently, where an interviewee has been so upset and just talked about suicide and so forth. So I've had to get onto the phone to HR to notify them of that, so they can put in processes to ensure their safety, and that sort of thing. So, but from an evidence point of view, from an investigator's point of view, whether they go to EAP or not is not relevant. I'm not wanting to hear what they tell the EAP person, because they're protected by confidentiality and offering some sort of medical or psychological sort of assistance. The evidence that I'll be obtaining will be when I interview that person and any other people and documents and so forth for the purposes of the investigation.
I think the only thing I'd add is sometimes there's a dual role. If you happen to be an internal HR provider who's doing the investigation as well, we would often state that we can't make people access an EAP, though we can share details and say, and I'll circle back, next week to see how you are, and that can be a subtle way to check in to see if they may have access. But it gets beyond our capacity to make sure that people do it.
And it's particularly the case if you're an external investigator. So you're not an internal HR person, you're an external investigator, and your instructions are to do the investigation. Obviously, from time to time, you're reporting to the person in that organisation that you're doing the work for. And the organisation with responsibility for ensuring their safety and so forth. I think that the investigator would have a responsibility to report on things such as the person just told me they're wanting to suicide. I mean, that you would have to tell the organisation that that's the case, you know, and I think that would be wrong for the investigator to not say anything. So, and then the organisation will take steps to look after that particular employee.
Yeah. And I think we're entering into that final 10 minutes of the session, and this is where we start to move, I guess, back into that space of revisiting the philosophy that you've been speaking to, from process and tactical to how do you frame that, the primary role of an investigator?
Thank you, Blake. So all that being said about the trauma-informed approach and confidentiality, the primary role of an investigator remains. So you're there to gather information and in order to establish facts. So you're collecting information. It's a fact-finding mission. You're clarifying events, asking questions, looking at documentary evidence and so forth. And ultimately, once you have all that information, you're determining on the balance of probabilities whether a complaint or grievance is substantiated. So those allegations that have been provided to the respondent, ultimately when all the evidence is obtained, what's the finding? Is it substantiated or not substantiated? And obviously, when we do a workplace investigation, it's a civil matter. So it's on the balance of probabilities. It's not a criminal matter where it's beyond reasonable doubt. But in terms of civil matters, what is important is the Brigadshaw rule or principle. That is an established common law rule that's quite important for investigators in other court type matters, tribunal matters, I suppose. But basically, there's a fairly sort of long definition or explanation, but I've tried to succinctly summarize this in a few lines. So basically, for more serious allegations, so an example would be sexual harassment or assaulting someone, touching, that sort of thing, the investigator must be satisfied on the balance of probability. So the civil standard does not change. But Brigadshaw says that if you're going to make a finding in that regard, make sure you have that based on strong evidence. Okay, so that's the principle there. So obviously important for the subject matter here, which is essentially focused on the sexual harassment, those sorts of serious matters. But so Brigadshaw is important. The other point to note is that the investigator is neutral, partial, you're independent. You've even got to do that even if you're internal HR. The principles of natural justice will still apply in that regard when you're doing the investigation. It must be a fair process for all, including the respondent, and I suppose particularly respondent in the sense that if adverse findings are made, then obviously you do the report, there's a report, there could very well be disciplinary matters that arise. And these disciplinary matters may not just extend to their working environment. These sorts of things can also extend to their private life as well. So you must be mindful of these sorts of things. Obviously, you're still being fair and so forth. The other thing is that the investigator is not a police officer. So you're not there as a disciplinary person to punish or warning or anything like that. You're essentially there to collect facts and make a decision based on the balance of probabilities. You're not there to fix the organisation, to do organisational development, counselling or mediation, that sort of thing. Again, it's an investigation where you've got to determine on the balance of probabilities whether or not allegations have been found to be substantiated or not. The investigator must be objective and not concerned about the view that suits the organisation. So, so you've got to be very mindful of these sorts of things, because in my experience, you can have some people that will try and influence you. They'll try and say that, we've got to protect this person or whatever it might be. So you've got to be very mindful to be absolutely objective based on your view on the evidence. So not an actual decision that suits one party over the other, in this case, the organisation. So very, very important to remain neutral, impartial, independent.
And Charles, in the research and through your experience, the importance of the supportive environment for yourself?
Yeah, so thank you very much. So this one was a very interesting slide, I suppose, in the whole scheme of things. So there was this, in Queensland, there was the Women's Safety and Justice Task Force. It was chaired by the Honourable Margaret McMurdo, AC, and it was established in March 2021 to examine coercive control and review both the need for a specific offence of domestic violence and the experience of women across the criminal justice system. So in this particular investigation found that most sexual assault cases are never reported due to the response they receive, and that namely is critical questioning. So obviously that was not in the workplace relations field, but when we saw that particular the study and the report there, that sort of rang home, and in terms of the workplace relations realm. Particularly, in the case of sexual harassment at the workplace, you can understand, this is just in my experience and talking to many people and so forth, that critical questioning would be the thought of being critically questioned after a person has been through a traumatic event such as severe sexual harassment would be something that would probably off-put women in terms of reporting these sorts of matters. And that could lead to underreporting of sexual assault or sexual harassment type matters because, again, they've been through a traumatic event. The thought of having to go through an investigation where they could potentially, although that would not be the case with a trauma-informed approach to critical questioning by an arbitrary investigator, that could be off-putting for someone that had been subject to a sexual harassment type matter. So I think that particular study rings home in the workplace relations setting as well, I think, just from my own experience in dealing with people. So that thought of critical questioning, that obviously should not be the case. And in terms of helping at the organisational phase, staff should be trained in the skills required to respond appropriately and sensitively to disclosure. So there might be that the manager is the person that is actually trained in this area. But obviously, of course, if the manager is the person that is the culprit, then there needs to be someone else. So it might be that there are key staff, for instance, throughout the organisation that have the skills and confidence to appropriately deal with these sorts of matters. So the ability to listen to people who are making these types of complaints or victims, for example, prioritising safety, explaining options in terms of the complaint process, or if it's a criminal type matter, it might be the case and that they be told that this might be a police matter, that you need to go to the police and so forth. Obviously, will be dealt with by HR policy and so forth in terms of how they advise, but explaining options is a good way. So connecting to appropriate support services and options for consideration, such as changing to working arrangements and so forth. These are sort of things that key staff should be skilled in to be able to sensitively deal with these types of disclosures. Because I suppose unless the organisation has a good environment, a sound environment for these types of matters to be raised, then they won't be raised at all. And that's not to say that what's actually alleged has happened, but certainly you can't deal with these sorts of matters unless they're raised at a formal level.
Excellent. And I think too, Charles, when we think about the context of investigators and the types of information that they are dealing with, and can be dealing with regularly, particularly of a trauma nature, the importance of self-care themselves, and the support networks available to help with their own welfare and well-being.
Yeah. So that's absolutely correct, and that's something we've done with internal training. So as an investigator, when you're this is the research. So if someone else is recalling a traumatic event, that can trigger yourself if you've had a traumatic event and so forth. So obviously, being an investigator and deal with these types of matters, complaints and so forth, can be quite wary on a person. So so you need to ensure your own health and safety as well, I suppose, in dealing with this difficult area.
Great, and I know we've hit 1 o'clock, so many people might jump off now. We've got one golden question before we wrap up. So we just had a question, and once Charles answers it, we'll say farewell. But with regards to sexual assault allegations, at what point does HR know if this becomes a police matter?
At what point? Well, so I suppose, if it's reported or not, that'd be one thing. But I suppose it's an interesting thing, because you can deal with the same type of matter in a civil way, which is under the sexual harassment sort of laws. And so that involves not only verbal and gestures, but touching and so forth. So that can be done in a civil matter, but arising out of those same set of facts, that would be sexual assault. So there's been many cases before the tribunals where there's been terrible sexual harassment, which would have been sexual assault. So the question will be whether or not it's reported. So to be up to the alleged victim to report those sorts of matters to the police. And if it is reported to the police, obviously it then becomes a sexual assault matter, which is handled by the police in that regard. If it's not, then it can be dealt with as a sexual harassment matter under the civil law. So it depends. I think it depends on whether the police are notified or not out of those sets of facts, because I think that out of the one set of facts, it can be both a sexual assault, which is a criminal matter, or it can be sexual harassment, which is obviously dealt with in a civil sort of matter. And obviously that would depend on whether there was touching involved. Okay.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks, Charles. Definitely worth hanging back an extra 120 seconds. So thanks for joining us, everybody, on the call today. Look after yourselves and each other, and we'll see you again. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Charles.
Bye.